I'm delighted to be with you, and I think there's two reasons that I got invited. The first is that I'm a veteran, and the second is that I'm 103 years old. So I'm often asked questions about the secret of longevity. On my 100th birthday, I knew I'd be asked about my longevity. So I went online to see if I could find somebody that had done this before and spoken when they reached 100. So sure enough, I found one entry on there. This man reached 100. He was asked, "What's the secret of your longevity?" And he said, "Spend a lot of time outdoors." So naturally, the audience wanted a little follow-up and said, "Well, tell us about it." He said, "I was married on my 25th birthday, and on our honeymoon, my wife and I made a covenant, and that was that whenever we had a difference of opinion, the loser would go outside." Well, I think there's other reasons for longevity, but at my age, I probably think more about heaven than I do about earth. I'll probably beat all of you there. So I'm picking up all the clues I can get so there'll be a smooth transition. So I read a story the other day about a woman who went to heaven. Her husband had preceded her by about 4 months. So she started looking for him, and they said, "Well, the receptionist, tell us more about him." "Well, his name is Joe." "Well, we've got millions of Joes up here. What's more specific?" And she said, "Well, a few weeks before he died, he told me if I ever looked at another man, he'd roll over in his grave." And the receptionist looked relieved, and she said, "Oh, Rollin' Joe, everybody knows Rollin' Joe up here." But I'm one of 21 million veterans that have become veterans in the last 75 years. And in my estimation, everyone is a hero. If the Department of Defense decided to decorate everybody that deserved it, they'd have to buy a copper mine in Utah, a cotton plantation in Texas, and a dye factory in Hong Kong to mold all the medals and print and color all the ribbons that are deserved. So, as I said, in my mind, all are heroes. Of the 21 million, 1.4 million are disabled. Another 250,000 suffer from post-traumatic distress syndrome. The number of homeless last year was 50,000. It's down to 39,000 now. And the suicide rate was 22 a day for a while. It's about 20 a day now, so there is some improvement. Since the Revolutionary War, nearly 1 million people have paid for our freedom with their life. So I'm just one of those veterans. I said one of the reasons I'm here is because I'm a survivor of the attack in Pearl Harbor. I was on the battleship West Virginia. We were moored in the harbor. There were 164 military ships in port because peace negotiations were underway. So we let down all of our guard, relaxed. The Japanese came in with 360 airplanes. And that day there was no radar that was trusted, no satellites. The first we knew that they were coming is when they saw them. So the first Japanese plane I saw, by the way, they painted their airplanes olive drab like the Army. It was not unusual to see Army planes on Sunday morning. So we at first thought they were our planes. But one of them came toward me, and when he got the right angle, his machine gunner cut loose. And he had to bank to get the right angle. Fortunately for me, he didn't bank far enough. And the bullets went over my head and dug a trench in the dirt behind me there. So my first reaction was surprise that we could be caught like that. And then the next was fear. I was afraid the next Japanese plane would be a little more accurate in his aiming. And then I became angry that our political and military leaders let us get caught in a situation like that. We had about more than 25 clues. If they had been interpreted correctly, we'd have known the attack was coming. And the Japanese were dependent on surprise. If they had been discovered, they weren't going to attack. So I was angry with our leadership. Then I made a resolve that if I ever got in a position of authority, we'd never be caught like that again. And so today, I feel it's necessary that the people who are making important decisions be combat veterans. People that have never been in combat are too optimistic. But the people that have been in combat, they're realistic, and I feel will make the right decisions. But as I said, overall, that morning my reaction was pride in the way that our men responded without any regard for their own lives and safety. Everybody did the right thing, just instinctively. So as I said, there were many heroes that morning. Well, that's a little introduction to me. I think I want to be asked some questions here that will add more here.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Morning, Jim. Thanks for that. I'm just going to talk loudly so Jim has the mic and everybody in the back hear me? Okay. All right. Good deal. Jim, if you don't mind, let's start with something easy. How many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren do you have?
Yes, my wife and I had 1.5 dozen children, our own flesh and blood. Now, make sure you quote me correctly. I didn't say 1.5 dozen. I said 1.5 dozen. We had 6, then we had a late child, so we had 1.5 dozen.
All right. Great. And then tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Plevna, Missouri, in your youth, all those years ago.
Yes, it's about 100 miles north of here. A small town. The population was about 110. And somebody has recently done some research, and the population today is 40. But I was born in 1913 outside of Kansas City at Oak Grove, Missouri. My great-grandfather bought several thousand acres out of the Louisiana Purchase. And we have the deed on sheepskin signed by President Martin Van Buren. Presidents probably didn't have too much to do in those days, so he personally signed the deeds. So a part of that is still in the family, so that my grandparents had the farm outside of Plevna.
Great. And then just to follow up with that, what did you all do for fun back then?
Well, we had, of course, athletics in school, but we had our own games, and of course we had a river close by so we could swim. But we had our version of hockey, only we used a tin can to beat around with a stick on there. So we never felt deprived because we didn't know anything beyond that. We were very happy. two-room schoolhouse. Went to school in 11 grades were there. And in the lower grades, they were combined to first and second grade and third and fourth. So I knew somebody going to school might have a second grade curriculum the first year, then the first the next year. So that helped the size of the classes for each teacher. But we were very happy without electricity, without running water, and without paved roads. In the wintertime, you couldn't leave town because the roads were so muddy. We had to wait until they froze over before we could get out of town. My grandfather had the first automobile in the county. It was a Model T Ford. And I used to wonder why, when we went up a hill, the passengers had to get out and push. But I've done some research and found out that the motor was 24 horsepower in that. That's just a little bit more than a power mower today. So it couldn't take a load of people up the hill. And on the Model T Ford, the carburetor was fed from a tank under the seat. So when you went up a hill, why, the gas in the gas line would run out. So the best way to cope with that was to turn around and back up the hill, because that kept the tank higher than the carburetor. So every long hill had a place to turn out, and then you back up the hill, then turn around and go on down.
That's interesting. Now, coming out of Plevna, what inspired you to join the military or the Navy in specific?
Yes, I graduated from high school in 1932, and that was the heart of the Great Depression. There was no jobs of any kind available. And so for a high school graduate in a small town, the military was the only way to get independent. So I was driven. I was not super patriotic, and I wasn't angry with anybody, didn't want to fight anybody. So my motivation was strictly economic.
All right, well, that's a good reason. What did you do for the Navy up to or at the point that Pearl Harbor happened?
I'd been in the Navy for 9 years, so
Okay.
I was somewhat of a veteran. A battleship like the West Virginia is 624 feet long. That's the length of 2 football fields and wider than a football field. We had a crew of about 1,500. That's a small city. So everybody has a battle station, which is the main reason they're on the ship. And it takes a lot of housekeeping for 1,500 people. But I fortunately was the postmaster. I had a good job, so that was my housekeeping duty, was being postmaster on the ship.
Great, yeah, those are floating cities, basically. Well, as far as what you were doing whenever the attack happened, let's say you and some of your comrades, do you remember specifically what you guys were doing that morning?
Yes, there were about 86,000 military personnel, including the Army, Navy, and Marines, Coast Guard, in the harbor that morning. Now, there were so many people that the city of Honolulu couldn't accommodate them, so unmarried people had to be back on board ship by midnight. I'd been married for 5 months, so I was home that weekend. And fortunately, I was close by, just a few minutes from my ship. So we were seated at breakfast. My wife and I had some military people with us, and we heard these explosions. The radio, we turned on the radio, and the announcer said, "We've been advised by Army Navy intelligence that the island of Oahu is under enemy attack. The enemy has not been identified. Stay tuned." So a few minutes later, he came back on and said the enemy has been identified as Japan. In the meantime, we slipped on our uniforms and headed for the harbor. We were about 15 minutes away from the harbor. So by the time I got aboard my ship, it had taken 9 aerial torpedoes. It was moored in 40 feet of water. A battleship draws about 36 feet, so we only had 4 or 5 feet of water under us. So it sunk down in the mud. 105 people were killed. Everything above the waterline was on fire. So I borrowed a fire hose from the ship we were tied up to try to extinguish the flame, which was moving toward live ammunition to prevent a secondary explosion. But as I was trying to beat the flames away from the ammunition, I saw bodies lying around. And we had fireproof name tags and lanyards. And my thought was, now, their parents will never know what happened. So I went around memorizing names, not too many of them. But that's the way I stayed until the flames were out. And then I did write the parents. Being the postmaster, I had their addresses and told them about their last minutes in life and how heroic they conducted themselves.
Wow, that's great, Jim, and I'm sure their families appreciated that. Something that I've always been curious about, maybe some people in the room have been curious about, is, you know, we always see and hear about the actual attack, but what happened after that? Did they get everybody into a rally point or a point to where they take accountability to make sure who's there and who isn't? What happened after the attack?
Yes, well, of course, the hospitals were very busy. That about 2,200 military people were killed, a lot more wounded. But there was the fear that the Japanese would make a second attack and maybe have a landing. So all the military installations began to set up command posts and troops to fend off a second attack. But it didn't occur, but the whole Sunday afternoon was spent fortifying the island to prevent a landing.
Right. Makes sense. I heard that you had the chance to meet the, I'm not sure if Ishida was a pilot, but who led the attack basically. How did that come about?
Yes, his name was Fushida. He was a 39-year-old Japanese pilot designated to lead the raid. So he had extra gas tanks on his plane. He flew around just directing the attack. After the war, he thought he was the only Japanese officer that attacked Pearl Harbor that survived. And he felt he must be a man of destiny. So he began to write a book. He called it No More Pearl Harbor. He had great remorse. But how do you tame the primitive instincts in man for revenge? And he said, how do you prevent Pearl Harbor happening again? Somebody gave him a tract about a POW, Japanese, captured an American serviceman named Jake DeShazer. While he was a POW of Japan, he became a Christian, got a Bible and became a Christian. So somebody gave Commander Fushida a copy of the tract, and he said he was changed by reading a Bible. I want a Bible. So an American missionary gave him a Bible, and as a result of that, he made a decision for Christ. I've got the details in that book that's back there of it. So 12 years after the attack, he came back to Hawaii and wanted to lay a wreath on the Arizona Memorial. So some of the Christians set up a reception for him, and my wife and I were invited. So as I headed toward him in the reception line, I wondered if I'd shake hands, wondered what I would say. Now, my wife was very emotional, and as she shook hands with him, she said, "Isn't it wonderful that we who were enemies are now brothers and sisters in Christ?" I was not that enthusiastic because as I looked him in the eye, I remembered seeing the lead plane up there dropping bombs on the ship next to me. He was in that airplane. So I was slow to shake hands, not very cordial. I told him, I said, "I was on the battleship West Virginia." He said, "Yes, I remember that ship very well." But it took a while, but I finally reached the conclusion, I've done a lot of wrong things. I thought he's done worse than I have, but God has forgiven him. So I accepted him as a brother in Christ. He became an international evangelist, and the Lord used him greatly after that. He's gone now, but he left a good heritage behind him.
That's great, Jim. That's a neat story. And you said it's in the book?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Speaking of faith, nowadays we have a lot of programs to help veterans with PTSD and a lot of the issues they might face coming back from, let's say, something you went through or something Jared went through. Did they have anything like that after World War II or during World War II, or was it mainly you just relied on your faith, or was it a little bit of both?
Well, for those on active duty, of course, the military has always had chaplains, and there's enough to minister to all. But as far as the program for veterans, no, there wasn't any program I'm aware of that, hospital treatment, a little bit of follow-up, but nothing like you folks are doing here.
So it was very, there was a lot of support from the chaplain, let's say faith. What was the dynamic of faith in, at least your experience in the military? Was there strong faith in the military back then? Was it just kind of each individual to their own, or what was the culture there in the military as far as faith goes?
Well, I don't want to be too critical, but when I went in the service, the evangelical chaplains were very few. And the average chaplain, I think they all used the same books to study. And so I heard them preach. What their message was do something nice, see something nice, and say something nice, and you'll be right with God. So it was all kind of a works-oriented. But in World War II, there were many evangelical chaplains throughout all the services. So there was a good atmosphere. Now, the organization I'm with, the Navigators, in 1935, started a ministry in the Navy on the battleship I was on, the West Virginia. And so we've had a tremendous ministry in the military and still do today, as well as on the college campuses. So if a person needed to turn to Christ, find Christ, there was a permissive atmosphere for them to do that. There have been several attempts to do away with the chaplain corps, but they've never succeeded. It's kind of interesting how we separate church and state, and yet millions of dollars of chaplains on the payroll.
Right, yeah, I have a few chaplain friends in the Army myself, and they provide a lot of support, just like they did for you and for Jared and any other veterans in the room. As far as faith goes after something like Pearl Harbor happens, do you think that an event like that brought you closer to God or stronger in your faith, or did it make you question things, seeing things like that with your own eyes?
Well, I learned a lesson that has influenced my whole life. That there was a little pause between the first wave and the second wave. And during that time, there was a gasoline tanker with a capacity of 6 million gallons of aviation gasoline that decided to cross the harbor. The Japanese sent in 75 fighters. They had practically no targets, so they were looking for targets of opportunity. They saw this tanker moving, and they had machine guns, didn't have any bombs, but they were like swarms of bees that would come down and shoot at this ship. So I was about 400 yards from it, and I thought, now pretty soon they're going to hit a vulnerable point, and we're going to go up. So my conversation with God during that time was, I'll see you in a minute. And then when the minute up, I was still alive, but for 30 minutes, that was my conversation. And during that time, I felt the deepest peace I've ever felt in my life. The Bible talks about the peace that passes all understanding. And Jesus said, my peace I give, not as the world gives, I give. I can't describe the depth of peace that I had. I think it was because I expected to be in God's presence just instantly. Kind of disappointed when it didn't happen. Now, what I learned out of that, 92% of the things we worry about never happen. Still sometimes, I get bent out of shape by things that happen and think that God's forgotten about me. He won't come to my rescue. He won't answer my prayer. And he's just so far away that I'm not connected. So the lesson I've learned is that I don't think that God responds to false alarms. He has the time and energy to do it. But if we're ever in a situation like I just described, it's because there's no danger, all in our mind. If there's real danger, why that peace. Now, God may not do what we want him to do, what we expect him to do, what we'd like for him to do, but he's there, in charge, and gives that great peace. I hope that I can spread that message around, that God doesn't respond to false alarms. And 92% of the things we worry about, as I said, never happen. So he doesn't show up for false alarms.
As far as your faith goes after Pearl Harbor and your service, can you walk us through, I mean, that was, say, 70-some years ago. How do you keep faith so strong that long? I mean, is there any one particular thing that you do? Is it going to church regularly? Is it reading the Bible regularly? Is it hanging around other Christians? What keeps you so strong in your faith?
Well, I came to Christ under the influence of the navigators that I mentioned. We started in the military on the ship I was on. We're in 110 countries of the world now. I spoke to a bunch of students last night at the university. We have chapters in almost every major university in the U.S. and many overseas.
Great.
Now, the mission of the navigators is to help bring Christians to maturity, believing that a mature person will reproduce. So that's what we want to do, is bring people to maturity so they reproduce. And that involves a strong grounding in the Word, in the Bible, reading, studying, meditating, and so forth. And balanced with that, D.L. Moody was once asked, what's the most important to a Christian, the Word of God or prayer. And he said, which is the most important to a bird, his right wing or his left wing? So of equal importance is a prayer life, and then outreach, witnessing. So I think that our organization, as well as many others that are working, have raised up quite a cadre of people that are mature and strong. So I give credit to the Navigators for making me a mature Christian.
Well, it seems like a great group. How did you come to find the Navigators?
At the beginning, it wasn't called the Navigators. There was a civilian by the name of Dawson Trotman that met some sailors on the West Virginia, 4 of them, and he invested in their lives and brought them to a place of maturity. Then there was a 5th guy added. There were a lot of people in the Navy in those days that joined the Navy strictly to earn money to go to college, and many of them entered the ministry. So the 5th guy that was in that group was a close friend of mine. And one morning, we were on a work detail handling frozen beef, about 600 pounds, in a refrigerator. I was very unhappy. But Virgil, his face was shining, smile on his face, humming a tune, the happiest person that, almost you'd ever seen. So I made an observation that any inward happiness I experienced was a result of outward favorable circumstances. I had contacts in Hollywood. If I was there, I was happy. But heaving frozen beef around was not my idea of happiness. So I made the observation, now, here's a man that has a resource that circumstances can't touch. I knew that's what I needed. I knew that's what I wanted. I knew that resource from his testimony was Christ. So I received Jesus Christ as my personal Savior, not because I was afraid of hell, but because I wanted the quality of life that he had. And that was 82 years ago. And I'm still enjoying that quality of life.
Well, obviously it works. 103 years old and made it through one of the largest attacks in history. You're here for a reason, and we're all glad that you're here. As far as the book's concerned, did the Navigators help you write the book? Did it help you inspire to write your books, or was it another catalyst that made you decide to start telling your story?
Well, about 10 years ago, as I would talk to my children and grandchildren, they'd say, we never heard that before. So I decided that I should put in writing the main events of my life for my children and grandchildren. So a publisher got hold of it and said that story needs to be told more widely than that. So the Navigators publishing business did publish the book.
Okay, gotcha. Well, that's great. So it worked out, you
Yeah.
being a part of the organization. Well, before we wrap things up, I want to get some of the valuable, unique experience and knowledge you have, and just ask if you have, and not to put you on the spot, but if you have one bit of advice to give this room of early risers this morning who came to hear you speak, or a succinct bit of advice, what would you say to them on their journey through faith in their own lives?
Yes, there are 2 things I think are very important. The first is what's recorded in the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. There's a promise. As you in all your ways acknowledge him, he shall direct your paths. The word shall is a strong Hebrew word, and it means guarantee. In all your ways trust him, he guarantees he will guide you. And every important decision I made in my life, I used that verse, believing he would guide me. So I think my life has been guided by God all the way through. So, for guidance, that verse. Now, it's too good to be true. Psalm 37:4, he says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. What a promise. No other way. In the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a verse that says, he set eternity in our hearts. And a great scholar named Pascal, a few hundred years ago, made the statement that God has placed in every heart a God-shaped vacuum. And the only thing that can fill that is God himself. So I have a great life, happy life. I don't think too much about yesterday or today or tomorrow because today is so much fun. But there's a promise of guidance and that he will give you the desires of your heart if you put him first.
It's good advice, Jim, and it's a good reminder to all of us. Matt, do you have anything you want to add or close out with?
Yeah, we'll just close our time with a few things. First, again, the book is going to be back there. They are signed copies. You didn't know that? And Jim is also willing to personalize those as well. So he has a pen he likes to use, and he can put your name on it or whatever you want. Just in thinking about Jim being here today, I didn't take down, like, these aren't all encompassing, but born in 1913, so you have World War I, kind of right out of the gate, and you have like the Roaring 20s. Like, these are things we read about. Like, you lived through them. Great Depression, then the New Deal, kind of rebuilding everything. And then World War II, Cold War, we landed on the moon, civil rights, disco, hair bands, Madonna, Gulf War, 90s, everything that happened in the 90s, and now like even, like we have cell phones, and like when he was born, who would have thought that I could text someone at the back of the room and we could communicate in that way silently, or across the country, or across the world, satellites, all this stuff, like just all the things he lived through, but he did it through just living each moment. So we had a small group at BU that was called Man Search for Meaning, and the author says that what you should do is think about yourself at the end of your life and then live your life backwards and make your decisions based on what you see at the end of your life. And I just think that's like a powerful thing, because the questions that we're asking him about, Ryan's doing a great job asking him these questions, are the present tense time that we're living right now. Like, I may never at 103 be sitting in that chair, but if I am sitting in that chair, the questions that I'm going to be asked are the times I'm living right now. And so going forward with that in mind, I think is helpful. Some of the legacy that we can learn from someone like this. He said about the Japanese commander who was flying that he left a good heritage behind him. And so I think that's the challenge, and that's why we have someone like Jim. That's why we want to like learn from his life and the lives of those around us that are different, to leave a good heritage behind us. And then I love how he closed too with the power of the word shall. Like, there is a power, a guarantee in the word shall, a guarantee that comes from above in some ways, but also the guarantee that comes from our choices day to day that allow us to live a legacy like this man has lived. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Jared for sharing. I want to thank Ryan. I especially want to thank Jim and his team that helped get him here. He is willing to talk with you. He's willing to sign books. You might have a question that didn't get asked. He'll engage with you. He might give you a smart answer, might give you a joke, because he has a lot of great things to say, a lot of great wit, a lot of great things to share. So stick around, engage with one another. Again, thank you for coming and making this part of your morning. Appreciate you, and God bless.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.